Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we walk the long stone roads of ancient Rome. We move through an empire built of arches and aqueducts, of armies and laws, of concrete poured 2,000 years ago that still holds its shape today. This is a collection of quiet facts about Rome, its engineers and its soldiers, its emperors and its roads, the strange details and the vast machinery of a civilization that once ruled most of the known world. Begin with the roads, because the roads came first. The Romans built more than 50,000 miles of paved highway across their empire, stone laid upon gravel, laid upon sand. Some of those roads still exist. People walk on them now. The same surface their feet would have touched 20 centuries ago. The very first of the great roads was the Appian Way, begun in the year 312, before the Common Era. It ran south from the city across the marshes and the hills, and it was so well made that the Romans called it the Queen of Roads. Parts of it remain. Worn black stones fitted tightly together, stretching off between the cypress trees. The Romans built their roads straight, wherever the land allowed. The road did not curve. It drove forward in a single line across valleys and over rivers, cutting through hillsides rather than going around them. Surveyors planned these routes using a simple tool called a groma, a wooden cross weighted with hanging cords, used to sight perfectly straight lines across the countryside. With nothing more than this, and patience and discipline, they aligned roads that ran true for mile after mile. A Roman road was not simply a flat surface. It was built in layers, like something living. A trench was dug first, then a foundation of large stones, then a layer of smaller stones and crushed material, then sand or gravel, and finally, the paving stones themselves, fitted tightly and slightly raised in the center, so that rainwater ran off to the sides. Drainage ditches lined the edges. The road shed water and survived the winters. Century after century, distance along these roads was measured in Roman miles. A Roman mile was 1,000 paces of a marching soldier, counted as full strides of the left and right foot together. The Latin words for 1,000 paces, mille passus, are where the very word mile comes from. Stone markers stood beside the roads at regular intervals, carved with numbers and names. These milestones told a traveller how far they were from the next town and how far from Rome. And there was a centre to all of it. In the heart of the city stood a gilded monument called the Golden Milestone, the Miliarium Aureum, set up by the Emperor Augustus. From this point, the distances of all the great roads of the empire were measured. The roads spread outward from it like the spokes of a wheel. This is where the old saying comes from. All roads lead to Rome. For a time, in a very real sense, they did. The roads carried messengers, and the messengers carried the empire. There was an imperial courier system called the cursus publicus. Relays of horses and riders stationed along the roads, ready to carry official letters across enormous distances. A message could travel 50 miles in a single day, passed from rider to fresh rider, moving faster than almost anything else in the ancient world. Through this slow chain of hooves and stone, an emperor in Rome could reach the edges of his world. And along these same roads, water travelled too, or rather, beside them and beneath them, in channels of their own. The aqueducts of Rome are among the most beautiful things the Romans ever made. 11 great aqueducts brought water into the city, built over a span of more than 500 years. Together, their channels ran for hundreds of miles, gathering water from springs and lakes in the distant hills, and carrying it patiently down toward the houses and fountains and baths of the capital. The first of them was the Aqua Appia, built in the same year as the first great road, 312 before the Common Era. It ran for about 10 miles, and almost all of it was hidden underground. The Romans buried it deliberately, so that no enemy could find the water supply and cut it or poison it. For its entire length, it descended gently through the earth, unseen, carrying the city's water in darkness. The aqueducts worked entirely by gravity. There were no pumps. The water moved because the channels sloped downward, very slightly, for its entire length, all the way from the source to the city. The gradient was astonishingly gentle. In some aqueducts, the channel dropped only a few feet. Over the course of a mile, the engineers had to maintain that fragile slope across rivers and valleys and uneven ground, mile after mile, or the water would stop flowing or rush too fast and tear the channel apart. They held the line when a valley was too deep to cross underground. The Romans raised the channel up on arches. This is the image most people remember. The tall stone arcades marching across the landscape, tier upon tier, carrying a thin ribbon of water along the very top. But the arches were only a small part of the whole. Most of every aqueduct ran hidden below the surface. What we see standing today is the rare and dramatic exception, the place where the water had to cross the sky. One of these crossings still stands in southern France, a bridge called the Pont du Gard. 3 rows of stone arches stacked one upon another, rising nearly 160 feet above the river below. It was built without mortar in its largest stones. The blocks cut so precisely that they hold together by their own weight and careful shaping. It has stood for 2,000 years. The water it once carried fell across its entire length of many miles by only a small fraction of its height. When the water finally reached the city, it did not stop. It flowed continuously, day and night, never shut off. Roman water ran always into public fountains, into basins, into the homes of the wealthy, and the overflow ran down through the streets and carried away waste into the sewers. A great Roman city was a place of moving water. The constant soft sound of it in the fountains, the shine of it in the channels, water that had begun its journey days before, in a quiet spring far out in the hills, and beneath the city ran the sewers. The greatest of them was the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain, one of the oldest structures in Rome. It was begun by tradition under the early kings, centuries before Rome was even an empire. It drained the marshy ground of the Forum and carried the city's waste down to the river. Parts of it are still in use today. Water still moves through tunnels that were laid when Rome was a small town ruled by kings. The pipes that carried water through the city were often made of lead. The Roman word for lead was plumbum, and the workers who installed and repaired these pipes were named for the metal they worked. From that single Latin word, we get our own words, plumber and plumbing. Every time we use them, we are speaking a small fragment of Latin, 2,000 years old. To build all of this, the Romans had a material that changed the world. They had concrete, not the first people to use a kind of cement. but the ones who mastered it, who poured it into vast shapes and let it set into artificial stone. Roman concrete was made by mixing lime with volcanic ash and water and broken stone. And the volcanic ash was the secret. They gathered it from the ground near the Bay of Naples, near a town called Pozzuoli, and so they called it pozzolana, mixed into the lime. It created a material astonishingly strong and astonishingly durable. Roman concrete could set underwater. This was its near magical property. The Romans poured it into wooden forms sunk beneath the sea and built harbours and breakwaters that hardened in salt water and stood against the waves. Modern concrete crumbles in seawater within decades. Roman marine concrete has survived in the sea for 2,000 years, and in some cases the salt water made it stronger. Over time, not weaker. Modern scientists have spent years trying to understand why Roman concrete lasts so long while our own decays. Only recently did they find part of the answer. Scattered through the old concrete are small white lumps of lime. For a long time, these were thought to be mistakes, signs of sloppy mixing. But researchers discovered that the lumps act as a kind of repair kit. When a crack forms and water seeps in, the water dissolves the lime, and the dissolved lime flows into the crack and hardens again, sealing it. The concrete heals itself. The very floors were a hidden strength. With this material, the Romans built domes and vaults. That had never been possible before. The greatest of them still stands in Rome, perfectly intact, in a temple called the Pantheon. Its dome is a single unbroken shell of concrete, and after nearly 2,000 years, it remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth. Nothing built since, with all our steel, has surpassed it in that one specific way. At the very top of the dome is a round opening, open to the sky, called the oculus. Rain falls through it. Light moves across the curved interior all day, like the slow hand of a clock. The dome is as wide as it is tall, a perfect sphere imagined into stone. To make the dome possible, the Roman builders did something clever. They made the concrete lighter as it rose. At the base, the mixture was packed with heavy stone. Higher up, they used lighter and lighter material. Until near the top, they mixed in light volcanic pumice, so light it could almost float. The dome grows thinner and lighter, toward its crown, and that is part of why it has never fallen. The arch itself was the Roman signature. They did not invent the arch, but they used it everywhere with total confidence in bridges and gateways and aqueducts and buildings. The strength of an arch comes from its shape, from the way each stone presses against its neighbors and turns the downward weight into a sideways push that the stones can bear. At the very top sits the keystone, the central wedge that locks the whole arch together. Remove it, and the arch falls. Set it in place, and the arch can carry enormous weight and stand for thousands of years. From the arch, the Romans built the vault. An arch extended into a tunnel, and from the vault, the dome, an arch turned in a full circle with these three shapes: the arch, the vault, and the dome. They built a world of stone interiors larger and more open than anything that had come before. Spaces wide enough to hold crowds, roofed without a single supporting column in the middle. The feeling of standing inside a great Roman hall was new in human experience, and the largest of all their buildings for crowds was the Colosseum. It rose in the center of Rome, an enormous oval of stone and concrete, and it could hold some 50,000 people. Its construction began under the Emperor Vespasian and was finished by his son Titus, who opened it with 100 days of games. In the year 80 of the Common Era, its real name was the Flavian Amphitheatre, after the family that built it. The name Colosseum came later, from a colossal bronze statue that once stood nearby. The Colosseum was a machine for moving crowds. It had 80 entrances. The ordinary passageways were called by a Latin word, vomitoria, because the building seemed to spill its crowds out through them. The whole audience, 50,000 people, could enter and find their seats, and later empty out again. In a matter of minutes, every spectator carried a token marking their gate, and their row, and their seat. Modern stadiums are still built on the same basic plan. 2,000 years later, above the seats, sailors worked the rigging of an enormous awning. It was called the velarium, a vast canopy of canvas that could be stretched over the open top of the arena to shade the crowd. From the sun, sailors from the imperial fleet were brought in to handle it, because they alone knew how to manage that much rope and cloth. On a hot day, The shadow of the awning moved slowly across the tiers of watching faces. Beneath the floor of the arena was a hidden world, a maze of tunnels and chambers and cages called the Hypergym, where animals and fighters waited in the dark before their turn. Wooden elevators and trapdoors lifted them up into the light of the arena, appearing suddenly as if from nowhere. Lions, bears, and stranger creatures from the far edges of the empire rose into the sunlight to the roar of the crowd, hauled up through the floor by ropes and counterweights worked by hidden men below. Ancient writers tell us that in its earliest days, before the underground chambers were built, the arena could be flooded with water, and mock naval battles were staged inside it. Small ships, real water, men fighting on the surface where lions would later run. Whether and how often this truly happened is still debated by historians. But the Romans did stage these flooded sea battles somewhere on a grand scale with thousands of men. They called them nomachii, and they were among the most extravagant spectacles ever attempted. Older and even larger than the Colosseum was the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing track in the valley between two of Rome's hills. It was the largest sporting venue ever built in the ancient world. A long oval stretching more than 500 yards, and at its height it could hold a crowd counted in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates run to 250,000 people watching the chariots thunder around the turns. No stadium since has reliably held so many. The charioteers raced in teams marked by colours: the reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens. People supported these teams with a passion that ran through every level of society, from slaves to emperors. A successful charioteer could become immensely rich and famous, cheered by the whole city. One of them, a man named Diocles, retired after thousands of races, and the record of his winnings survives. By some reckonings, the fortune he earned would make him among the highest paid athletes in all of history. But the true engine of Rome was not the games. It was the army. The Roman legion was one of the most effective military organizations ever created, and its strength was not in any single weapon, but in its order. A legion at full strength held around 5,000 men. It was divided and subdivided into smaller and smaller units, down to the smallest group of all, the contubernium, 8 men who shared a tent, cooked together, and fought side by side, 8 men who knew each other completely. The whole vast army was built up from these small circles of trust. The Roman soldier carried his world on his back. He marched with his armor, his weapons, his cooking gear, his tools, and his rations, a weight that could approach half his own body. The soldiers joked bitterly that they were not an army, but a column of mules. Marius's mules, named for the general who had made them carry so much. They could march more than 20 miles in a day under that load and then build a fortified camp before nightfall, because that is the thing the Romans did that few other armies bothered with. Every single night on campaign, the legion built a camp, not a rough circle of tents, but a proper fort, with a ditch and an earth rampart and a wooden palisade, laid out always to the same plan, with the same streets and the same gates, in the same places. A soldier could walk into any Roman camp anywhere in the empire and know exactly where everything was. Each evening they dug the ditch and raised the wall, and each morning, if they were moving on, they tore it down and marched. The soldiers' main weapons were simple and deadly. A short, stabbing sword called the gladius, made for close fighting in tight formation, for the quick thrust rather than the wide swing. And a heavy, throwing spear called the pilum. The pilum had a clever design. Its long iron neck was made soft, so that when it struck an enemy's shield it bent on impact and could not be pulled out or thrown back. A shield with a bent pilum stuck through it became useless and had to be dropped. The Romans engineered even their spears to defeat the enemy twice. In battle, the legionaries fought behind large curved shields, and they could lock those shields together into formations with names. The most famous was the testudo, the tortoise. The men at the front and sides held their shields outward, and the men behind raised theirs overhead, until the whole unit was covered above and around by a solid shell of wood and iron. Arrows and stones rained down and clattered off it harmlessly, and beneath that shell the soldiers advanced, slow and protected, toward the enemy walls. The Romans were patient besiegers. When they could not take a fortress quickly, they built. They threw up ramps of earth. They raised siege towers taller than the walls, and they used machines that hurled stones and bolts They had a great bolt-throwing engine like a giant crossbow, and a stone thrower called the onager, the wild donkey, named for the brutal kick it gave when it fired. At one famous siege against a mountain fortress called Masada, the Romans built an entire enormous ramp of earth and stone up the side of the mountain to reach the defenders. The ramp is still there. Roman discipline could be terrible. For the worst failures of an entire unit, there was a punishment called decimation. The men of the disgraced unit were divided into groups of 10, and each group drew lots, and the one chosen by chance was killed by the other 9, 1 man in 10, chosen at random, put to death by his own comrades. It was rare because it was so severe, but the word survives in our language still, carrying a shadow of that ancient cruelty. The reward for service was land and citizenship, and a place in the most successful war machine of the age. And with that machine, over centuries, Rome conquered the world it knew at its greatest extent under the Emperor Trajan. The empire stretched across some 5 million square kilometers and 3 continents, from the rainy hills of Britain in the north to the deserts of Egypt in the south, from the Atlantic coast of Spain in the west to the rivers of the Middle East in the east. The entire Mediterranean Sea lay within its borders, and the Romans, with a kind of confident affection, simply called that sea Mare Nostrum, our sea. Tens of millions of people lived under Roman rule. Estimates vary widely, but the empire at its height may have held 50 million people or more. Perhaps a fifth of all the human beings alive on earth at that time. They spoke dozens of languages and worshipped countless gods, and they were bound together by roads and law and the long reach of the legions. At the far northern edge of all this, across the wild hills of Britain, the Emperor Hadrian drew a line in stone. Hadrian's wall ran from coast to coast across the narrow neck of the island. Some 73 miles of wall and ditch and fort, marking the edge of the Roman world. Beyond it lay the lands the Romans never fully held. Soldiers from across the empire, from Spain and Syria and the Rhine, stood watch on that cold northern wall, far from home, watching the mist roll in over the heather. Long stretches of the wall still stand today, running over the green hills to hold such a vast world together. Rome needed more than soldiers. It needed law, and Roman law is perhaps the most enduring thing the Romans ever made, more lasting even than their roads and their concrete. The legal systems of much of the world today still rest on Roman foundations. The very earliest Roman laws were written down on 12 tablets. The 12 tables set up in the Forum around the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, so that the law would be public and known to all, and not just the private knowledge of the powerful. To make law visible was itself a revolution. From the Romans, we inherit a whole vocabulary of justice. The idea that a person should be considered innocent until proven guilty. The principle that the burden of proof lies on the one who accuses, not the one who denies. The concept of a contract, of property, of a last will and testament. Even many of the Latin phrases survive untranslated in courtrooms today. The Romans thought about law with extraordinary care, drawing fine distinctions, arguing cases, building over centuries a vast and subtle structure of legal reasoning. Centuries later, long after the western half of the empire had fallen, an eastern emperor named Justinian gathered all of this scattered law together. His scholars collected the centuries of Roman legal writing and organized it into a single great work, later called the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It preserved Roman law for the future, and through it, Roman ideas of justice flowed down through the medieval world and into the modern one. When a law student anywhere studies today, somewhere beneath what they learn lies the work of those Roman jurists. Rome itself changed its shape of government over its long life. It began by tradition as a small kingdom ruled by kings. Then the Romans drove out their last king and founded a republic, governed not by one man, but by elected officials and a senate, with power deliberately divided so that no single person could seize it all. For nearly 500 years, Rome was a republic, and during that time, it conquered most of its empire. The word republic itself comes from the Latin res publica, the public thing, the affair of the people. At the head of the republic stood 2 consuls, elected together for a single year, 2 so that each could check the other. 1 year, so that no one could hold power long. The Romans were deeply afraid of kings, having thrown one out, and they built their whole system around preventing any one man from rising too high. In times of dire emergency, they would appoint a single dictator with absolute power, but only for 6 months, after which he was expected to lay it down and return to ordinary life. One famous man, Cincinnatus, was called from his farm to be dictator, saved the city, and then gave up his power and went back to his plough within days. For centuries, the Romans told that story as the model of what a leader should be. But the Republic did not last forever. In its final century, it was torn by civil wars, as ambitious generals turned their loyal armies against the state itself. The most famous of them was Julius Caesar. After conquering Gaul, all of modern France and beyond, in a long and brutal campaign, Caesar was ordered to give up his army. Instead, he marched it toward Rome. To reach the city, he had to cross a small river that marked the legal boundary of his command, a river called the Rubicon. To cross it with his army was an act of war against his own country. He crossed, and from that day, to cross the Rubicon has meant to take a step from which there is no return. Caesar won his civil war and made himself dictator, not for 6 months, but for life. And for that, a group of senators who feared he had become a king, in all but name, killed him. They stabbed him to death in the Senate on the 15th of March, a date the Romans called the Ides of March. He fell at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey. His death did not restore the Republic. It only began a new round of wars. Out of those final wars rose Caesar's young heir, Octavian, who defeated all his rivals and ended a century of civil war. He was careful never to call himself king or even dictator. He took instead the modest-sounding title of first citizen and a name of honor given to him by the Senate, Augustus, the revered one. But he held all real power, and he ruled alone. Historians mark his rise around 27 years before the Common Era as the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, the first of the emperors. Augustus ruled for more than 40 years, and he transformed the city. He famously boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He brought peace after generations of war, a long peace across the whole Mediterranean world that later ages called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For roughly 2 centuries, by the standards of the ancient world, the vast empire was largely free of major internal war, and trade and travel flowed safely along the roads and the sea lanes. The months of our own calendar still carry the memory of these men. The month of July is named for Julius Caesar, and the month of August for Augustus. Caesar had reformed the calendar itself with the help of astronomers, fixing the year at 365 days, with a leap day added every 4th year. This Julian calendar was so well made that it served much of the world for 16 centuries, and our modern calendar is only a small refinement of it. When we add a day to February every 4 years, we are following a rule that Caesar set. The emperors who followed Augustus were a mixture of the capable and the catastrophic. Some were wise administrators who governed carefully for decades. Others were unstable young men given absolute power over the world with predictable results. There was Caligula, remembered for cruelty and madness, who is said, perhaps only in later rumour, to have wished to make his favourite horse a consul. There was Nero, who ruled while a great fire burned much of Rome, and whom legend accuses of singing and playing music while the city burned, though the famous image of him fiddling is impossible, since the fiddle would not be invented for 1,000 years. There were also the good emperors, as later Romans called them, Trajan, under whom the empire reached its greatest size, Hadrian, who built the wall in Britain and rebuilt the Pantheon, and travelled tirelessly across his lands, and Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the empire while also writing, in quiet moments in his tent on distant frontiers, a private notebook of philosophy. He never meant it to be read by anyone. It survives, and people read it still, 2,000 years later, for its calm reflections on duty and mortality, and the shortness of life. Around the emperor stood a special body of soldiers, the Praetorian Guard. They were the only armed troops normally allowed inside the city, the emperor's own bodyguard. But over time, they grew dangerously powerful because the man who controlled the guard could control the emperor. More than once, the Praetorians murdered an emperor they disliked and raised up another. On one notorious occasion, They are said to have auctioned the throne itself to the highest bidder, selling the rule of the world to the man who promised them the most money. The protectors became the kingmakers, and then the king's undoing. The city they guarded was the largest in the ancient world. At its height, the city of Rome held around 1 million people, a size no European city would reach again for more than 1,000 years afterward. 1 million people fed by grain shipped across the sea from Egypt and North Africa, supplied with water by the aqueducts, entertained in the Colosseum and the Circus, housed in tall apartment blocks that crowded along narrow streets, to keep 1 million people fed and watered. And from rioting was itself one of Rome's great engineering feats, invisible and constant. Fire was the city's great terror. The apartment blocks were built tall and close, and often shoddily, of timber and brick, and fires spread through them quickly and killed many. To fight this, the Romans created one of the first public fire brigades, the Vigiles, the watchmen. Thousands of them patrolled the city at night, watching for flames, equipped with buckets and pumps and hooks for pulling down burning buildings. They were firefighters and night police together, walking the dark streets while the city slept. Before the Vigiles, in the days of the Republic, fire protection had been a private and often corrupt business. One of the richest men in Roman history, a man named Crassus, was said to have built much of his enormous fortune on fire. He kept a private brigade of firefighters, and when a building caught fire, he would rush to the scene. And there, while the flames rose, he would offer to buy the burning building and those around it from their panicked owners at a tiny price. Only once he owned them would his men put out the fire. It was a cruel and brilliant scheme, and it made him one of the wealthiest men who ever lived. The Romans counted their years and wrote their numbers in a system we still recognize, the Roman numerals, made of letters, I for 1, for 5, X for 10, L for 50, C for 100, D for 500, M for 1,000. We still see them on clock faces and on the cornerstones of buildings and at the ends of films. But the Roman system had a strange and important gap. It had no zero. The concept of zero as a number had not yet reached the Roman world, and doing arithmetic with their numerals was slow and difficult. For serious calculation, the Romans reached instead for a counting board, an abacus, sliding beads, or pebbles in grooves. And that humble word, pebbles, hides another piece of Latin. The Latin word for a small stone used in counting was calculus. From the pebbles they pushed across the counting board, we get our words calculate and calculation. A Roman doing his sums was, quite literally, playing with stones. Latin itself never truly died. It changed. Across the Western Empire, the everyday Latin spoken by ordinary people slowly drifted, region by region, century by century, into new tongues. In time, it became Italian and Spanish and French and Portuguese and Romanian. These are the Romance languages. And the word Romance here means simply descended from Rome. Hundreds of millions of people today speak languages that are Latin, grown old and changed. When they speak, a faint echo of the Roman Forum is still moving through the air. Even English, which is not a Romance language, is full of Latin. A great share of English words descend from Latin, borrowed across the centuries through law and learning, and the church. The words for many serious and formal things in English are Roman words wearing modern clothes. We carry Rome in our mouths without knowing it. The Roman army gave us still more words. The word salary may come from the Latin word for salt, salarium, and the old story holds that soldiers were once paid in salt, though historians now doubt the literal truth of it. The phrase worth his salt carries the same shadow. The Roman soldiers' hobnailed sandals were called caligae, and the cruel emperor known as Caligula got that nickname as a small boy in an army camp, dressed in a tiny soldier's uniform. Caligula means little boots. The terror of the Roman world was named by affectionate soldiers for his baby shoes. Our words for power and politics are Roman too. A man seeking public office in Rome would put on a specially whitened toga, bleached bright, so that he stood out as he moved through the crowds, asking for votes. The Latin word for that gleaming white was candidus, and a man dressed in it was a candidatus. From his bright robe we get our word, candidate, and from the same root our word, candid, for something clear and unclouded. The ruling council of Rome was the Senate, and its name comes from the Latin word for an old man, for it began as a council of elders, the grey-haired heads of the leading families, the symbol of a Roman magistrate's authority, was a strange and simple thing, a bundle of wooden rods bound tightly together around the handle of an axe, called the fasces. Attendants called lictors carried these bundles before the high officials wherever they went, a walking emblem of the power to punish and to execute. The image proved astonishingly durable. Long after Rome, the bundle of rods kept appearing as a sign of state authority and unity, and it can still be found carved and cast into the emblems of governments around the world today. An ancient Roman shorthand for power, hiding in plain sight, and the Romans left behind objects we still cannot explain, scattered across the northwestern provinces of the empire. Archaeologists have found small, hollow bronze objects with 12 flat sides, each face pierced by a round hole of a different size, with little knobs at every corner. These Roman dodecahedra have turned up by the dozen, and no one knows for certain what they were for. No ancient writer mentions them. Theories abound, from measuring devices to candle holders to objects of ritual, and none has been proven. They sit in museum cases now, beautifully made, utterly silent about their purpose. A small, genuine mystery left by the most documented civilization of the ancient world. The Romans worshipped a vast crowd of gods, and many of them still hang in our sky. The planets carry Roman names. Mercury, the messenger. Venus, the goddess of love. Mars, the god of war. Jupiter, the king of the gods. Saturn, his father. Even the metal Mercury and the month named for Mars, March, and a dozen other words trace back to these deities. When we look up at the red planet and call it Mars, we are using the name the Romans gave it, for the same red color that made them think of blood and war. The Romans were also great borrowers. They took the gods of the Greeks and matched them to their own. They took Greek art and copied it endlessly. And because the Romans made so many marble copies, many famous Greek statues survive today only as Roman copies. The originals are lost, and what we see in museums is the Roman version, made by a craftsman in Italy of a masterpiece he had, perhaps only heard described. Rome preserved the Greek world even as it conquered it. The empire's reach changed the very food and land of distant places, but it also changed how people kept time within a day. The Romans divided daylight into 12 hours, from sunrise to sunset, and night into 12 more. But because the length of daylight changes with the seasons, a Roman daytime hour was longer in summer and shorter in winter. Their hours stretched and shrank with the turning year. A summer hour of daylight and a winter hour of daylight were not the same length at all. Time itself breathed with the seasons. The wealthy told the hours with sundials, and when the sun did not shine, with water clocks. Vessels that measured time by the slow, steady dripping or rising of water. In the law courts, a speaker was given only so much water in the clock for his speech, and to ask for more time was to ask for more water. To this day, a long-winded speech and a draining vessel are quietly linked in the history of the word. Out at the edges of the empire, the Romans left their mark on the land in ways still visible from the air. The way they divided conquered farmland into neat squares, a system called centuriation, can still be seen in the field boundaries and roads of parts of Italy and France and North Africa today. The modern countryside is laid out on a Roman grid drawn 2,000 years ago. The lines redrawn again and again by every generation of farmers since, without ever quite erasing the original plan. The Romans built bridges that still carry traffic. In Spain and Italy and across the old empire, there are Roman stone bridges over which cars now drive. The arches that once bore ox carts now bearing trucks, holding firm after 20 centuries. The engineers who cut and set those stones could not have imagined the loads they carry now. They built simply for permanence, and permanence is what they got. They moved enormous weights with simple machines, cranes powered by men walking inside great wooden wheels, like treadmills. The turning of the wheel, winding up a rope, and lifting blocks of stone many tons in weight, with nothing but timber and rope and human muscle, and the patient logic of the lever and the pulley. They raised columns and roofs and statues to heights that seem impossible for the tools they had. They cut and moved obelisks too. Several of the ancient Egyptian obelisks that stand in Rome today were brought there by the Romans, hauled out of Egypt and carried across the Mediterranean in specially built ships and raised upright in the city. Rome holds more standing ancient Egyptian obelisks than the city of Egypt from which they came. The Romans loved these tall stone needles, and they went to staggering effort to possess them. For all their engineering, the Romans were also a deeply superstitious people. Before any important act of state, before a battle or an election or the founding of a city, they would consult the will of the gods by watching for signs. Special priests called augurs studied the flight of birds across the sky, the direction they flew, their number, their cries, and read in them the favor or disfavor of the gods. To do something with proper ceremony and good omens was to do it under good auspices. And that word, auspices, comes straight from the Latin for bird watching. Others read the future in the entrails of sacrificed animals, especially the liver, examining its shape and markings for messages from the gods. Whole careers and the timing of great public events could hinge on whether the signs were judged favorable. The most rational engineers in the ancient world, the builders of aqueducts and domes, would not lay a foundation stone until the birds had flown the right way across the sky. The Romans gave us the names of the days in a roundabout way, and the very layout of our week owes something to their world. They gave us the idea of dividing time into ordered, repeating official units, of public calendars carved in stone showing festival days and market days and the days when business could be done. Time itself, made public and official and the same for everyone, was a Roman habit of mind. The shared schedule of a whole society is a quietly Roman invention. They were endlessly practical. They invented a kind of central heating that ran warm air beneath the floors of buildings, and concrete-lined pools and glass windows. Though we will set the details of their houses aside tonight, they standardized the manufacture of bricks, stamping them with marks that tell us today exactly which workshop made them, and often in which year. A Roman ruin can be dated by reading the maker's marks pressed into its bricks, like tiny signatures left in the clay, waiting 2,000 years to be read. They ran an empire on paperwork. The Roman state kept census records, tax rolls, military discharge documents, property deeds, and endless official correspondence. Soldiers were given bronze diplomas recording their service and their grant of citizenship, and some of these bronze plates survive, naming a man and his unit and the day he was honorably released. A small, permanent record of one ordinary life in the legions. The empire ran on records, and a surprising number of those records, scratched on bronze or wood or stone, have outlived the empire itself at a remote fort on the northern frontier, in the cold and the damp. Archaeologists found thin wooden tablets covered in ink writing, preserved by the wet ground. They are the everyday letters of the people who lived there. A soldier asking for more beer for the garrison, a list of supplies, and most famously, an invitation from one officer's wife to another, inviting her to a birthday party, written in part in her own hand. It is among the oldest surviving writing by a woman in the Latin world, a small, warm voice asking a friend to come and celebrate across 1900 years of silence. The empire's wealth flowed in along the trade routes from the very edges of the known world. Roman coins have been found buried in India and beyond, carried east in exchange for silk and spices and pepper. The Romans craved pepper from India and silk from far-off China, lands they barely knew and never reached, connected to them only by long chains of traders passing goods from hand to hand across deserts and oceans. A Roman noblewoman might wear silk spun by people on the other side of the world, in an empire she had never heard of. To pay for all this, the Romans minted coins on an enormous scale, and the coins themselves were tools of communication. Every coin carried the emperor's portrait and a short message, news of a victory, a virtue, a building program spread to every hand in the empire. In a world without newspapers, the coin in your purse was how you learned the face of your ruler and the things he wished you to believe. Hoards of these coins are still dug up across Europe today, buried by frightened people in troubled times who never returned to reclaim them. The Romans told a story about where their city came from, and it was a story of wolves and brothers, twin boys, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants and set adrift, were found and suckled by a she-wolf on the bank of the river, and grew up to found a city on the hills above. In the founding, the brothers quarrelled, and Romulus killed Remus and named the city for himself, Rome. In its own telling, was born of a wild animal's mercy and a brother's blood. The Romans dated this founding to a year we would call 753 before the Common Era, and for centuries they counted their years from it. From the founding of the city, the Romans counted time by their leaders and their wars, but they organized their lives around the soldier. The army was not always a professional force. In the early republic, the legions were citizen farmers who left their fields to fight and return to them when the war was done. It was a general named Marius who changed this, opening the ranks to the poor and the landless, and turning the legion into a paid profession that a man could follow for his whole working life. Augustus made the change permanent, creating a standing army with fixed terms of service, regular pay, and a pension of land or money at the end. A Roman soldier could now serve for 20 years or more and retire to a farm. It made the army loyal and professional, and very dangerous to the politicians who paid it. When those soldiers retired, they were often settled together in new towns, planted deliberately across the conquered lands. These colonies of veterans became the seeds of cities that still exist. London began as the Roman Londinium. Paris was the Roman Lutetia. The German city of Cologne carries the word colony in its very name, from the Latin colonia, for it was founded as a Roman settlement. Vienna grew from a Roman frontier fort on the Danube across Europe. The map of where cities stand today was drawn, in large part by Roman soldiers, choosing where to build a fort or settle a band of veterans 2,000 years ago. The last great rival the Republic destroyed was Egypt, and its fall is one of the most famous stories of the ancient world. The Queen Cleopatra allied herself and her kingdom's wealth with the Roman general Mark Antony against the young Octavian who would become Augustus. The two sides met in a great sea battle at Actium, off the coast of Greece, and Octavian won. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and took their own lives. And Egypt, the last and richest of the old kingdoms, became a possession of Rome. But it was no ordinary province. Egypt became the personal property of the emperor himself, and above all, it became Rome's granary, for Egypt fed Rome. The grain that kept 1 million people in the capital from starving came in enormous quantities across the sea, from Egypt and North Africa, in a great fleet of cargo ships that sailed each year, a vast and reliable food supply for the largest city on earth depended on that yearly voyage. The emperors knew that a hungry city was a dangerous city, and so they provided not only grain but games. The free bread and the public spectacles that a later Roman writer mocked together in a single bitter phrase: bread and circuses, the two things, he said, that the people now cared about above all else. To land all that grain, the Romans built artificial harbours where nature had given them none, near the mouth of the river below Rome, at Ostia, and at the great basin called Portus. The emperors carved enormous harbours out of the coast, with breakwaters of that miraculous underwater concrete reaching out to embrace the ships. And at the harbour mouth stood a lighthouse, a tower with a fire burning at its top, through the night, modelled on the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, guiding the grain fleet safely in across the dark water. The fire burned every night so that the ships that fed the city could find their way home. At the very heart of the city burned another fire, one that was never, ever allowed to go out. It was the sacred flame of the goddess Vesta, tended day and night in her round temple by a small order of priestesses, the Vestal Virgins, 6 women, chosen as girls, who served the goddess for 30 years and swore, in that time, to remain chaste. They were among the most honoured people in Rome, with rights and privileges no other women had. But the price of failure was horrifying. A Vestal who broke her vow of chastity was buried alive, sealed in an underground chamber, because her sacred body could not be struck. And if the eternal flame went out, it was taken as a sign of catastrophe for the whole city. So the fire was watched and fed and kept alive, year after year, century after century, a single flame at the center of Rome. The Romans even tunneled through mountains to keep their roads straight and their cities linked, where a hill could not be gone around. They dug through it. Near Naples, they cut a road tunnel through a ridge that ran for the better part of half a mile, so that travellers passed in darkness through the solid rock, of the headland and out the other side, on one of the great northern roads. The engineers drove a tunnel straight through a mountain spur above a river gorge, working from both ends to meet in the middle, to bore through stone with hand tools, by torchlight, and have the two tunnels meet, required surveying of a precision that still impresses the engineers who measure their work today. Rome was not always the master of the sea. In its early centuries, it was a land power, and when it first fought the great sea empire of Carthage across the water in North Africa, the Romans had almost no navy at all. So they built one quickly, copying a wrecked enemy warship that had run aground, and training their rowers on benches set up on dry land before the ships were even finished. And because they were better at fighting on land than at sea, they invented a device to turn a sea battle into a land battle. It was a boarding bridge with a great iron spike at the end called the corvus, the raven. When an enemy ship drew close, the bridge dropped, the spike bit into the enemy deck, and the Roman soldiers charged across it as if storming a wall. With this clumsy, brilliant idea, a nation of farmers defeated the finest sailors of the age. The wars against Carthage were the most dangerous Rome ever fought. There were 3 of them, spread across more than a century, and they are called the Punic Wars. In the second of them came Rome's most famous enemy, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, who did the thing no one believed possible. He marched an army with war elephants out of Spain, over the Alps, through the snow and the high passes, and down into Italy from the north. He destroyed Roman army after Roman army. At a place called Cannae, he surrounded and annihilated a force far larger than his own, in what is still studied as one of the most perfect battles ever fought. For years, he roamed Italy undefeated, and still Rome would not surrender. Rome won in the end by carrying the war to Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal home to defend his own city, and beating him there at last. And a generation later, Rome finished the matter. In the Third War, it besieged Carthage, took it, and destroyed it utterly, burning the city and selling its people into slavery. The old story that the Romans sowed the ground with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again is almost certainly a later invention. But the thoroughness of the ending was real. A rival that had nearly destroyed Rome was wiped from the earth, and Rome stood without an equal in the Western world. The wealth of that conquered world poured into Italy, and much of the labor that built Rome was the labor of the enslaved. Slavery ran through every part of Roman life, and at times the enslaved rose against it. The most famous revolt was led by a gladiator named Spartacus, who escaped from a training school with a handful of others and gathered around him a vast army of runaway slaves, tens of thousands strong. For 2 years, they defeated the armies sent against them and marched up and down Italy. In the end, the revolt was crushed by Crassus, the same man who grew rich on fire. As a warning to any who might follow, 6,000 of the captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the Queen of Roads, their crosses lining the road into Rome for mile after mile. The soul of a Roman legion was not its general, but its eagle. Each legion carried a standard topped with a silver or gilded eagle, the aquila, and to lose it in battle was the deepest possible disgrace. A legion would do almost anything to protect its eagle or to recover one that had been lost. The most terrible loss came in a German forest called Teutoburg, where 3 whole legions, led by a commander named Varus, were ambushed and destroyed, and their eagles taken. It is said that the aging Emperor Augustus, hearing the news, would beat his head against the door and cry out, "Varus, give me back my legions." For years afterward, the Romans hunted to recover those lost eagles from the tribes who held them. When a Roman general won a truly great victory, the city honored him with a triumph, the grandest parade the ancient world could offer. The victorious commander rode through the streets in a chariot, his face painted red like the old statues of the gods, while his soldiers followed singing, and the spoils of war and the captured enemy leaders were led along behind him for the whole city to see. And there is an old tradition, half legend, that a slave stood behind the general in his chariot through all the cheering, holding a golden crown above his head and whispering in his ear, again and again, a reminder: look behind you. Remember that you are only a man at the very summit of glory, a voice murmuring of mortality. The gladiators who fought in the arena were mostly enslaved men. prisoners of war and condemned criminals, though some were free volunteers who chose the life for money and fame. They were trained in schools, fed and exercised like valuable athletes, and matched against one another in carefully arranged pairs, each with his own style of arms. There was the net and trident fighter, lightly armoured and quick, set against a heavily armoured swordsman, the hunter against the fish. A defeated gladiator could appeal for mercy, and his fate was signalled by a gesture of the crowd and the editor of the games, a turn of the thumb whose exact meaning is still argued over. Many died young, but a successful gladiator could win his freedom, symbolized by a wooden practice sword presented to him, and walk out of the arena a free man. The emperors raised great monuments to their victories, and many still stand. In Rome, there is a tall stone column carved from top to bottom with a spiraling band of sculpture, like a scroll wound around a pillar, telling the story of the Emperor Trajan's wars in a continuous picture that climbs more than 100 feet into the air. Trajan's column has stood for 19 centuries, and at its base were placed the emperor's own ashes. To build it, the masons cut huge drums of marble, hollowed them, and stacked them so cleverly that a spiral staircase runs up the inside, hidden within the solid-looking column, for that same emperor's wars. His master engineer, a Greek named Apollodorus, built a bridge across the great river Danube that astonished the ancient world. It was the longest arch bridge that had ever been built, more than 1,000 yards of timber arches on stone piers, spanning a river so wide and wild that no one had bridged it before. For more than 1,000 years after, no longer bridge would be built anywhere. The wooden arches are long gone, but some of the stone piers still stand in the river, worn stumps marking where Roman engineering once crossed the edge of the world. The empire ran on metal, and to get it, the Romans tore the mountains apart with water. At a place in the north of Spain, they mined for gold on a scale that left the landscape permanently scarred, still visible today as a strange country of red pinnacles and cliffs. Their method was to channel water from the hills through tunnels dug into a mountain, then release it all at once so that the trapped water and air burst the mountain apart from within, washing whole hillsides down through sluices where the gold was caught. The Romans themselves called this method the wrecking of the mountains. They moved more earth in search of gold than any people before the modern age, with nothing but water, gravity, and the labor of thousands. The Romans were masters of glass as well as stone, and they made it on an industrial scale, blowing it into bottles and cups and even fitting panes of it into windows. There is an old story told by Roman writers themselves of a craftsman who came before the Emperor Tiberius with a bowl of glass that would not break. He threw it to the floor, and instead of shattering it, only dented like metal, and he tapped it back into shape with a small hammer. According to the tale, the emperor asked whether anyone else knew the secret, and when the man swore that no one did, the emperor had him killed, fearing that unbreakable glass would make gold and silver worthless. The story is almost certainly a legend, but the Romans told it about themselves, a fable of an emperor who would murder the future to protect the value of the past. Rome's power was argued as much as it was fought. In the law courts and the Senate, the art of public speaking was prized above almost any other skill, and the greatest of all Roman orators was Cicero, a man who rose to the top of the state through the sheer force of his voice and his words. His speeches were copied and studied and learned by heart for centuries, and much of what we know of the late Republic comes from his own letters and arguments, preserved in enormous number. He was killed in the chaos after Caesar's death, on the orders of his enemies. But his words outlived all of them, and school children were still learning Latin from his sentences nearly 2,000 years later. The thing that bound this enormous, varied empire together was, in the end, the idea of being Roman. And over the centuries, that idea opened wider and wider. To be a Roman citizen carried real and valuable rights, protections under the law that others did not have. And for a long time, citizenship was a privilege held by a minority. Then, early in the 3rd century, an emperor named Caracalla issued an edict that granted citizenship to almost every free person in the entire empire. At a single stroke, millions of people who had been mere subjects became, overnight, Romans in full. It was perhaps the largest extension of legal belonging. In the ancient world, a Gaul and a Syrian and a North African, all now citizens of the same Rome. In its later centuries, the empire was reshaped by 2 enormous figures. First came Diocletian, who found the empire in chaos and decided it had simply grown too large for one man to rule. He divided its government, sharing power among several rulers for different regions, an arrangement meant to bring order to a sprawling, threatened world. And then came Constantine, who reunited the empire under himself, founded a great new capital in the east, at the city that would bear his name, Constantinople, and did something that changed history forever. He ended the persecution of the Christians and embraced their faith, setting in motion the transformation of the Roman world, and through it, much of the world that followed, into a Christian one, the empire of the old gods, of Jupiter and Mars, became the empire of the new faith. The Roman year itself still leaves its fingerprints on our own, in a small puzzle hidden in our calendar. The months we call September, October, November, and December take their names from the Latin words for 7, 8, 9, and 10, yet they are the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th months of our year. The mismatch is a fossil of the old Roman calendar, in which the year once began in March, the month of the war god, with the coming of spring, counted from March. The numbers come out right. We still carry the Roman spring in the names of our autumn and winter months, the count beginning 2 months and 20 centuries away. For all its strength, the empire eventually grew too large to defend. Pressure came on every frontier at once, from peoples beyond the rivers and the walls, and the long peace gave way to a long unraveling. The empire was divided, for ease of governing, into an eastern half and a western half, each with its own emperor and capital. The western half ruled at the last not even from Rome, but from other cities, slowly weakened, its armies dwindling, its borders crumbling. In the year 476 of the Common Era, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a boy who bore, by a strange accident of history, the names of both Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, was quietly removed from his throne. No great battle marked it. The Western Empire did not so much fall as fade, its authority dissolving into the new kingdoms that grew. Up inside its old borders, the lights did not all go out at once. they dimmed, one by one, over generations. But the eastern half did not fall. From its capital at Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire endured for nearly another 1,000 years. The people of that empire never stopped calling themselves Romans. We call them by another name now, the Byzantines. But that is a label invented by later historians. They knew themselves as Romans to the very end, keeping the name and the law and the memory of the city far away that most of them would never see. Rome, as an idea and an institution, outlived Rome, the city, by a millennium. And even after the Eastern Empire finally fell, Rome would not stay dead. Its idea was too powerful to bury. Centuries later, a Frankish king was crowned emperor in Rome, claiming to revive the empire of the West. Later still, a great Central European realm called itself the Holy Roman Empire, and lasted for the better part of 1,000 years. The rulers of Russia took the title Tsar, and the German emperors the title Kaiser, and both of those words are simply the name Caesar, worn down by time and distance and foreign tongues. Long after the last legion laid down its arms, men still wanted to be called Caesar. The very shape of our public buildings is Roman. Look at the great government buildings and banks and courthouses of the modern world, with their rows of columns and their domes and their triumphal arches, and you are looking at Rome, reborn again and again, because each new power wanted to borrow Rome's authority and Rome's permanence. The architecture of seriousness and the state, almost everywhere, still speaks Latin, and the ruins themselves remain, scattered across 3 continents, slowly returning to the earth. The broken aqueducts striding across the countryside, their arches half fallen, their water long gone, the roads buried under newer roads, the old stones surfacing now and then where the modern surface wears thin, the Colosseum standing roofless in the heart of a living city, its outer wall partly collapsed, stripped over the centuries of its marble and its iron clamps, by people who saw it only as a quarry of useful stone. For more than 1,000 years, the Colosseum was treated as a source of building material. Popes and princes carried away its stone to build palaces and churches. The holes you can see in its walls today are the empty sockets where iron clamps once held the blocks together, dug out and melted down long ago when iron was scarce. The greatest building of the ancient world slowly came apart in the hands of people building their own smaller worlds. From its bones, yet so much survives. The Pantheon's dome, perfect and whole. The rain still falling softly through its open eye onto the marble floor below, where a small drain set in the ancient pavement carries the water away, exactly as the Roman builders intended. The roads you can still walk, the bridges that still carry traffic, the aqueduct arches gold in the late evening light, the Latin words moving through 100 living languages, the law in the courtrooms, the numerals on the clock. Rome fell, and Rome did not fall. It dissolved into the world it had made, until the world itself was partly Roman, and could not tell any longer where Rome ended and ordinary life began. The empire is gone. The roads remain. The emperors are dust, and their faces still look out from the coins turned. Up in farmers' fields, the legions marched home long ago into silence, and somewhere tonight, in the cool dark, an old Roman road runs straight across a sleeping countryside. The paving stones worn smooth, grass between them, moonlight on the stone. An aqueduct stands against the stars, its arches empty now, the water gone. The forum lies quiet under the same moon that once lit the speeches and the crowds, stone remembering warmth, the slow settling of 2,000 years. The dome holds its shape in the darkness. The arch holds its stones. Rain gathers softly somewhere in the hills, where a spring still rises that once fed a city, water moving in the dark, stone cooling, the long road going on, beyond the edge of sight, into the night, quiet now, the marble cool, the water falling through the open eye of the dome, onto the old floor, in the dark, rain on ancient stone, the road, and the moonlight, and silence over Rome,